Hello, everybody. Welcome back again. Today, I've got a particularly special guest. Today is joining me is Ed Conway. Now, Ed's daytime job is economics editor at Sky News, but he is also the author of one of my frankly favorite books that I've read, I think, in the last couple of years. And this book is called
Oh,
Material World. Now, Material World is a description, or sorry, talks about the idea of these named six key materials within our world that effectively have driven and will continue to drive, frankly, society, economic growth, and the push to net zero over the next many years. And so I've got Ed on today because I want to talk about this amazing book and get his views on not only net zero but the economics behind it and some fascinating insights into his book. So Ed, thank you for joining me.
thanks, Adam. It's good to be here.
Look, I want to kick off in terms of summary. And when I read this book, I think what strikes me about this book is I think this book is frankly about trade-offs, and it's trade-offs that
Okay.
and people, I think there's a lot of polarization about the net zero world and what we need to do with to get there. And to be net zero, we've just got to do less mining. We've got to stop digging stuff out of the ground. And what your book tells me, or what I took from your book, is actually like most things in life, this is a lot more nuanced, and actually there are going to be
Hmm.
significant trade-offs around how we continue to develop and grow society with it at the same time by not destroying the planet. Do you think
Yeah.
that's a fair assessment?
I think that's definitely a part of it. So when I started writing the book, I didn't really see it as primarily a book about net zero. I kind of just saw it as a new prism through which you can look at the world, and just quite an unfamiliar one. In a strange way, this stuff should be obvious, but it isn't. What are the materials that keep us alive? What are the processes that civilization depends on? That stuff kind of should be obvious. And I kind of, it should be an integral part of economics. And yet, as an economics specialist, I found kind of coming to this world, there was so much that kind of took my breath away because it was so unfamiliar. And I think partly that's because we've forgotten, particularly in developed economies, particularly in places where manufacturing is a much lower part of GDP, particularly where most of us work in services. I work in services, you work in services. The vast majority of people in this country work in services. And that's where a lot of our wealth comes from. We've kind of just somewhat forgotten the basics of what it takes to get stuff out of the ground, to convert it into the products that we use these days, and what the kind of trade-offs, like you say, are along the way. And I guess as I kind of went deeper into that, I kind of found a couple of things. First of all, this book is about the six materials that you kind of, that we all need in the world, to keep our kind of civilization going. Um, but it's also about something else. It's about energy transitions.
Yep.
It's about how we deploy energy to take simple stuff like sand or iron or copper, and turn it into amazing things like lithium ion batteries. So lithium into turning it into these extraordinary things, which is not a given. It's an amazing achievement that we have managed to do that. And I think actually kind of underappreciated. It took us a century to work out how to turn lithium into a battery.
Mm.
And we are still benefiting from that now. And that's part of what makes net zero more plausible and possible than it was only a few years ago. But yeah, partly it's about those kind of energy transformations, because you need a lot of energy to turn simple stuff into complex stuff. All of the activities that I talk about, whether it's making semiconductors, whether it's making glass, whether it's turning iron into steel, these are massively energy intensive processes.
Yep.
And so I found myself all along the way thinking, hang on, this is not just about the substances, it's also about energy.
Yep.
And then secondly, as the book went on, I guess this was always the plan, because I always wanted to have a battery material towards the end. I realized a lot of it was kept coming back to net zero. And I think the reason for that is we have set ourselves this task, getting to net zero by 2050, eliminating carbon emissions in net terms. We set ourselves that task, and I say we, politicians mostly.
Hmm.
In the UK in 2019, it was signed into law under Theresa May. It was the last thing she did before leaving office, without really thinking that hard about precisely how we would get there.
Here,
And
absolutely.
how we will get there is it turns out going to be really, really tough. I think it's doable, and I'm kind of more optimistic than many people I come across, but it's going to be bloody tough,
Yep.
and I just don't think people have been made aware of quite the scale of that, or indeed the fact that while in the long run there might well be economic benefits, certainly against the alternative of just allowing kind of further fossil fuel use and in an untrammeled way, what happens to the environment. There are economic benefits. However, it costs something. It costs quite a lot to do this, it turns out,
Yep.
because we're shifting every different energy transition. Like I say, the book is partly about these substances, but along the way, these substances allow me to talk about the energy transitions that humankind has gone through in the past. So we went from wood to coal. The iron chapter actually has a lot about that.
Yep.
An extraordinary moment in humankind, the first industrial revolution, from coal to oil, from oil to gas, along the way, electricity playing a part. In each of those kind of transitions, we were going to ever more energy dense fuels. And so in some ways, once we had kind of mastered it, there was an economic argument behind it because, it was much more efficient. You were able to get more energy along the way, and we were deploying more energy. And part of our story as humans, as productive creatures, has been the deployment of ever greater amounts of energy to do more stuff, because everything in the economy is ultimately a form of energetic transformation.
Yep.
So the difficulty with net zero, aside from other things, is that we are trying to go down the energy ladder. So we're going to less dense sources of energy, whether it's kind of the wind or solar transformed into battery storage. That's quite inefficient in comparison with the amount that you can get from a given kilogram or whatever it is of oil or coal. And so that's kind of a thermodynamic challenge and an economic challenge that I don't think has been kind of fully appreciated. And also, not only are we trying to go down the thermodynamic ladder, we are trying to fit this energy transition. When I talk about those previous energy transitions, whether it's wood to coal, coal to oil, oil to gas, and so on and so forth, they tend to take many, many decades. And sometimes, with coal, some would argue that transition is only now kind of coming to an end.
Yep.
Some would argue that the full oil energy transition is still ongoing. These things arguably take kind of a century, yet we're trying to do this in basically a couple of decades. And that is 2.5 at the moment. That is a greater challenge from an industrial perspective than I think anything that humankind has ever set itself in the past. And I think the final thing I'd just say on that is that, partly, like I say, this book is kind of just about how the world works, how we make stuff, how it gets into our hands and so on. But what you realize when you're kind of understanding, this is how a silicon chip is made, is that there is so much carbon that's emitted along the way. I mean, one of the things that I hadn't realized certainly is that in order to make the silicon wafer that then later becomes a silicon chip, that first conversion where you take the chunks of silicon out of the ground and turn them into what they call metallurgical silicon, which then later becomes part of that really pure wafer.
Yep.
That first transition involves basically throwing it into a massive furnace, an electric arc furnace, alongside coal. So because partly for the chemical reaction, so that the coal helps to take away some of the oxygen from the silicon. So it's kind of like the Middle Ages in these places where solar panels and silicon chips are made, because they're basically the same thing. And you realize that even the kind of cleanest, whizziest stuff that we use these days involved quite a lot of carbon emissions and quite a lot of energy to make it. And so part of the challenge of net zero is trying to reimagine not just the kind of stuff that we're familiar with, like wind turbines and electric cars and exchanging petrol engines for electric. It's also about trying to reimagine the entire suite of industrial processes that are keeping us all alive. And that is much more knotty and for me also more fascinating as a kind of thing to write about. But also by the same token, it's challenging. I don't think we've quite realized the degree of, as you say, trade-offs, the degree of challenges that we're facing. Like I say, I go between kind of optimism, because I'm inherently kind of pretty optimistic about this, and desperate pessimism, because there's a lot of delusion about how easy this is going to be.
Yeah. No, look, thank you. That was a great synopsis. And I think the optimism side, and certainly towards the end of the book, without jumping too far ahead and without giving the game away, I did feel as though you do strike an optimistic tone. I think it's in the last or second last or last chapter, and the way you describe the nature of use of fossil fuels in terms of through history, we have simply the energy transfer has been dig a fossil fuel out of the ground and just burn it, and then that
Yeah,
creates the energy.
right,
Whereas the
right,
modern way we're talking about is actually that fossil fuel, yes, that is still dug out of the ground, but instead that becomes an input to something else. And so actually
correct.
the fossil fuel itself is not necessarily, well, it might be burned in terms of the process, but the energy release, instead of going out, stays in the process and continues
Yeah,
on there. And
yeah.
I found that really interesting as well, because as you say, the idea of these making a microchip, making a semiconductor, is enormously energy intensive, and the idea of and so it's for everybody, hopefully. And this is again why I really enjoyed the book, because it gives people an understanding of, okay, there are still going to have to be this, we still should focus on carbon capture or whatever, but
Mm.
actually it's done in a different, it's not in the way that you think. It's not in the way of just burning oil or burning coal and then capturing that,
Yeah,
which obviously is still important, but it's in all terms of the other processes. Um,
yes.
so brilliant. And I just wanted to, for the sake of, and I realize I didn't say this before, we've talked about the six materials, but I just want to highlight exactly what those six materials are for the listeners.
Sure.
So
Yeah, I
they
should have
are
said.
they are sand, salt, iron, copper, and lithium. And the way I want to structure this conversation is kind of just in each, if you basically take a few chapters in each, around each of those materials. So I just want to dig into some of them, because you've got some, like, I don't know, some great insights and some, frankly, questions that I've certainly raised. So you talked about silicon before. You talked about semiconductors. So
Yeah.
and the basis of that is sand. So let's start with sand. So sand, clearly, you talk about the idea of making glass,
Hmm.
important, concrete, and most importantly, semiconductors. And you mentioned
Hmm.
two specific in that sort of semiconductor supply chain. Effectively, you mentioned two different plants that actually are so instrumental to this process that it actually blew me away to think that where our entire world survives on effectively the idea of one particular mine in North Carolina called Spruce
Mm.
Pine. Can you
Yeah,
just talk a bit more about Spruce Pine and what actually that means and how important Spruce Pine is? Because
sure.
no one's ever heard of
Yeah.
this before.
No, I know. And it's so I guess the genesis for this was that I don't know if you've ever, there's a great essay called I Pencil by a guy called Leonard Reed. It was written in the 1950s, and the gist of it was that he wanted to tell the story of how a pencil is made. So it's written from the first person, I
Yeah,
Pencil,
I think I've heard of
and
it.
and it's all about, like, it's kind of amazing. I remember reading it when I was kind of trying to get my head around economics years ago, and being like, wow, because it talks about, this is where the wood comes from, this is where the graphite comes from, this is where the eraser comes from, and the zinc that kind of goes on the end of the between the wood and the eraser, all that stuff. And it's basically kind of making a point, which is that this is an incredibly complex supply chain for that most simple of all things, a pencil. And part of the point that back at the time was it was kind of anti-central planning. So this was during the Cold War. Milton Friedman championed this essay because he saw it as being a really good example of why the market works. And indeed, that's true. No one in the pencil supply chain knows precisely how to make a pencil. They just know how to
Mm.
make their little bit of it, the wood
Yep.
or the graphite or whatever it is. And I kind of wanted to do the same thing ish with silicon chips. So I kind of wanted to start where the physical stuff comes out of the ground and go all the way through to the end point, the mobile phones that we have, the smartphones we've got. And I found, like, there've been some great books about what happens at the end. So that the fabrication plants in Taiwan, Chris Miller's book Chip War, which came out last year or the year before, is just fantastic on that. But I kind of wanted to go all the way back to the mine, where the stuff, I wanted to lay my hands on the stuff that eventually becomes a silicon chip, basically, because that's the point of this book. Where does it begin in the ground? If it's not grown, it's mined. And
Yep.
basically almost everything we're touching on a daily basis is mined somewhere. I kind of just wanted to to understand where it began in the earth, that stuff that later becomes these kind of gadgets that we use. And so I kind of went all the way down, and the fascinating thing about that supply chain is that even before your silicon wafer, which is their very pure kind of wafer of it, it's actually pretty much the purest thing that humankind has made. Before that silicon wafer, that big round kind of pizza star shaped kind of very pure bit of silicon arrives at the fabrication plant where it's imprinted with all the transistors and then becomes a computer chip. Even before it's arrived there, it has probably been around the world a couple of times before and been through so many different processes. Like I say, it starts in a kind of furnace that feels like the Middle Ages, but then you've got other processes, two other processes which make it incredibly pure and also which make the atomic structure incredibly ordered. So you take the silicon out of the ground, and here's the thing that I found striking. I thought it did come out of the ground as sand, and it is part of my sand chapter, so I'm cheating here slightly. I wanted to have silicon chips, but I thought it did come out of the ground as sand. Actually, it does. It is kind of the same atomic kind of chemical structure basically as sand, the silicon that later becomes the silicon chips. But generally speaking, when you get it out of the ground, in order to put it into one of those furnaces where you're going to start making metallurgical silicon out of it, it needs to be in big chunks, because otherwise, if it's sand, then the sand would just get caught in the convection of this 1,500 degree furnace. The sand would just float up in the convection current and gum up the filters. And so for very pragmatic kind of engineering reasons like that, actually it turns out it's not sand. And the ironic thing, actually, talking to people at the top of the supply chain, who actually make the silicon chips, they were all like, well, it's sand, isn't it? And I had to kind of eventually say to them, well, actually, no, it turns out it's not. Underlining the fact that no one knows how a silicon chip is made. Yeah. And as far as I know, this is kind of like the first effort to try and explain that. But along the way, so one of the things you need to do after you've taken the sand, this quartzite as it's called, so the silicon out of the ground, you've turned it into metallurgical silicon, so it looks like a metal. You've then taken that metallurgical silicon and turned it into what's called polysilicon. You're basically kind of breaking it down atom by atom and then reforming it. So it's incredibly pure, 99.9999999% or something like that. It's 9 nines, they call it. Purity of silicon, like the purest thing pretty much that we're capable of making as a species. You then need to, again, break it down and then try and reform it into a perfect silicon matrix so that the atoms are completely perfectly lined up. And why are you doing that? It's because you're working at an atomic scale when it comes to semiconductors. You need those atoms to be in the right place so that those electrons can travel within your circuit perfectly. Anything that's not literally perfect in a silicon wafer means that you're going to disrupt that flow, and then your silicon chip isn't going to work. So purity and order are kind of like so important for these things that, in our pockets, that we kind of take for granted. So much work has gone into making them, even before you get to Taiwan and TSMC and all of that stuff. But in order to kind of make that perfect atomic structure, you need to melt down that incredibly pure 99.99999% pure polysilicon. They call it polysilicon. It's just, that's 99.999% pure silicon. It's just the name they give it. You melt down your silicon in this crucible, and then you pull it up using a kind of called a seed crystal. And it's this old process, very strange thing. You're pulling up this massive, what's called a boule of silicon from a molten pool of the stuff in this vacuum chamber, making this incredible, like I say, the most perfect atomic structure that we mass produce in the world. It's amazing just to make these devices that we take for granted. But in order to make that work and for it to be really pure, you need a really pure crucible in which you're melting that polysilicon. And the quartz that you need for that crucible, so it needs this particular atomic structure. It needs to be particularly pure. That quartz, there's only one place in the world where you can get that quartz, or at least in large quantities where you can get that, and that's a mine in North Carolina called Spruce Pine. And basically every silicon chip in the world, whether it's made in China, whether it's made in Taiwan, whether it's made somewhere else, in Europe, has at one point in its life had to sit in one of those quartz containers with the quartz that came from this single place in North Carolina, Spruce Pine. And yeah, I mean, like the funny thing about kind of going down these various wormholes in, what I call the material world, is that every so often you do come across these pinch points where it turns out one single place is all important for us. Like another example of one is in the salt chapter, I kind of look at it's a part of one of the most interesting things about salt is that it's also is not just that we need it sprinkled on our chips.
Mm.
It is also the bedrock for much of the chemicals industry these days. And a lot of, well, basically 98% of the tap water in this country is purified using chlorine that comes from a single plant in Cheshire. Why is it in Cheshire? It's because that's where the salt is. So the plant is kind of on top or very near where the salt deposits are. The salt comes out, they electrolyze it and turn it into chlorine and hydrogen and a few other things. If I went to visit this plant, it is, arguably one of the most important single places in the UK, but no one's ever heard of it. If it goes down, then within 7 days, we're rationing drinking water. And these places, it turns out there are quite a few of them all, around, dotted around. But because, I don't think much attention has been paid to this world, whether it's the manufacture of silicon wafers or how you get the chlorine that goes into your drinking water. We're kind of not aware about this stuff until something, God forbid, goes terribly wrong in the future. So there's a lot of those little places that seem to have almost a monopoly on the provision of certain things. There's this guy, I don't know if you've heard of it, a guy called Hermann Simon, who's a German economist, and he wrote a book called Hidden Champions. And it's kind of about, when you're looking around the world at companies, I guess, to invest in, you should try and pick the ones where they have if not a stranglehold, then definitely they're really dominant within some obscure sector you've never heard of. So I kept finding these hidden champions and thinking, God, okay, well, it's kind of semi-monopolies, but it's just because that, A, I guess no one's paying much attention to it, and B, these are such efficient kind of processes that so much of them is bound up in a single place.
Well, I think that's when I was reading this with my investing hat on, I was thinking, because as an investor, you always look for scale, you look for companies that have a natural moat, as Warren Buffett describes it, and being the global dominant monopoly player in a super critical infrastructure is as big as moat as you're going to get. Can I just go back to sand and spruce pine and silica for a second in terms of the chips? Because the idea, and this is actually just extending this conversation a bit more into probably your day job, if you like. But if we extend this slightly to say, okay, Taiwan Semiconductor is significantly important to the global, almost probably the most important, you could argue, company to the global world that we exist in. And also there is, you could argue that potentially it is actually significant with the idea of China going into Taiwan. That is almost that particular company alone is the single biggest pinch point around the global economy in terms of if that happens, and if Taiwan Semiconductor is effectively knocked out as far as a valuable supplier of chips, then the entire, I'm not going to say the entire world economy comes crumbling down, but bad things happen. So you mention also in your book about how, because of this particular, the crucible or the silica, that China has had trouble actually producing the advanced semiconductor chips. And that's been backed up by a number of other, news reports, and how China still continues to have trouble. Well, you mentioned the idea of making their own ballpoint pen. They've hopefully solved that one. But B, making these advanced semiconductors, and it's still a point of discussion between the US and and China in terms of this. I guess in your mind, I mean, how much of an impact do you think this potentially has into, if any, idea of China going into Taiwan, and but at the same time, how much also then does this drive the argument that the US is effectively doing with semiconductors what they did with oil 25 years ago, as in the US realized they were not self-sufficient in oil 25 years ago, and sending troops to go and die in the Middle East was not a sustainable path. Oil was critical, so they developed their own industry. You could argue that the US now is following that same path with semiconductors. And at some point in the next 5, 10, whatever years, they will be, you would imagine, self-sufficient in terms of semiconductors.
I don't think
puts Taiwan in a difficult situation. What are your thoughts?
Well, it does. It does. So I don't think, having kind of traveled up and down that supply chain, I just don't think there's any way you could route all of that in one country. I just think it's impossible. It bestrides the globe. And talking about kind of dominant companies, so TSMC is one, most obviously. TSMC is the only company so far which has been able to make logic chips down to those kind of 2 nanometer dimensions. They call them, by the way, 2 nanometers, but actually it's not really 2 nanometers. It's a bit bigger than that, but that's just the naming convention. But those are the most advanced, the smallest things, and it is just mind-boggling how small this is. It's smaller than the wavelength of visible light. That's how small these transistors are. They're smaller, considerably smaller than like a coronavirus, or 1,000 times smaller than a red blood cell. Each of these little transistors that go inside your device. I think it's one of the most magical, amazing achievements of humankind. Still more so because it's so prevalent. Everyone has these devices. In the developing world as well, everyone's got smartphones, and inside those smartphones is a little bit of nanotechnology. So I think it's kind of amazing and something to be celebrated. But yeah, TSMC is way ahead, and they're ahead of Intel. The irony here is that Intel was one of the big funders of this. So you need a particular type of technology to be able to imprint transistors that are that small. It's called extreme ultraviolet lithography. Lithography is just a way of taking light and kind of imprinting it onto a silicon wafer, and then you use chemicals to kind of get rid of the bits that have been lasered off. And the machine. So Intel was one of the companies which was investing early in the machinery to be able to do this. It just so happens they haven't worked out how to really use the machines, which it turns out is actually a really important and very much not trivial thing, because it's really hard, even if you've got the best equipment, to be able to turn these things out at scale. And people kind of forget about this because semiconductors are such a kind of advanced technology. The thing that a semiconductor plant prides itself on, generally speaking, is its yield. So it's being able to have a silicon wafer where 90% of the little chips that are kind of imprinted along it, because it's a round silicon wafer, you print out lots of little tiny things, which can be a centimeter, like a stamp size square, and then you slice it all up. So you're getting a lot of little chips from each of these silicon wafers. But the things that a lot of these places pride themselves on as yield is being able to get as many reliable chips out of a single piece of silicon wafer. And TSMC is just really good at it. They're just really good at running that manufacturing process and leveraging the tools that are there. It's worth saying that, talking about kind of monopoly, like hidden champions, it's no longer so hidden, but even more of a stranglehold is enjoyed by a company called ASML, because ASML is the company that makes the machines that allows you to do this. So in every TSMC fab, there are a lot of ASML, these massive things, the most expensive machine tool in the world, which enables you to kind of create this extreme ultraviolet light. But it's crazy extreme EUV. It doesn't exist in the atmosphere. So they're actually magicking up this type of light that doesn't really exist in order to beam it down onto these chips. It does that, by the way, because the wavelength of normal visible light is too big. So it's too cumbersome to get actual light. The more time I kind of spend thinking about these things, the more my mind boggles, and I find it so exciting.
Absolutely.
But ASML is the only company which is able to make those machines. So there's another monopoly there, and interestingly, they're a Dutch company.
Yeah.
And within each of those machines, you've got lenses made by Zeiss, a German company, lasers made by Trumpf, which is another German company. So there are lots of there's a lot more Europe within the semiconductor supply chain than you might have thought. But so far at the moment, like you say, and by the way, ASML is one of those companies. It was massively supported by the Dutch state for years and years and years. Everyone said for years and years and years, why are we subsidizing this useless company, which is trying to do this technology, which everyone knows will never be able to happen? And now it is one of the world's most important companies, arguably just as, if not more important than TSMC, because without ASML, you don't actually have the machines that allow TSMC to do what they do. So there are kind of lots of different pinch points, but yeah, I think you're totally right that Taiwan is just right in the center, and also South Korea, because Samsung is the other company which is able to make quite those which is able to use EUV lithography. They tend to use it for memory chips, I think, as far as I can understand, and I think storage. And so that's a little bit different. It's not the logic chips, the brain of the phone or the computer. But a lot of people say that TSMC is, I mean, it's clearly not the main reason. I mean, there's a long history of the story of Taiwan and China that goes back, obviously, to the period of the Communist Revolution. So TSMC is only a kind of a recent chapter in it, but it definitely exacerbates, it definitely underlines part of why China would rather like to have that China, Greater China. There are even stories, doing the rounds. I don't know how true they are, but that TSMC should or even has installed explosives inside each of its fabs, so that in the same way that people used to kind of explode bridges when they were retreating in the war, so that you could explode the fab if the Chinese do invade. I don't know how true that is, but it's something that the Americans can talk about a little bit. Well, but just back to your, just finally though, the Americans, like what's interesting about this supply chain though, okay, which is quite distinct from a few other things, is that while America doesn't have any of those plants making the kind of super small transistors, because Intel hasn't quite cracked it yet. I think they will crack it soon, but they've had a real nightmare doing it. America is really has a foothold, if not a stranglehold, foothold on so many different other parts of that supply chain, so all the way down to silicon wafers. It's got places there. So I think in semiconductors, it's in a much better position than it is, for instance, with batteries or solar panels, where China is way, way ahead in terms of production and innovation.
Fascinating. And just to extend on that, and so look, TSMC is also in the process of building a fab in Arizona as well, aren't they? So you are going to get.
But interestingly, they're struggling there. They're struggling, and I think they're struggling just to get, because it is quite a very intensive skill thing. They're struggling to build it, but they're also struggling to find people who can actually make the chips, and that's because the skill of taking these machines and using them to turn out lots of really high yield silicon wafers with really low dimension transistors is just really hard. It's a high skill thing, and a lot of those skills just reside in Taiwan. And historically, I mean, this is the interesting thing. Historically, they've always been a bit nervous about allowing that to go elsewhere. So they do have a few other plants elsewhere, but whether you're really going to see the super advanced chips being made there, I don't know. So we'll see what happens in Arizona.
Let's see. That's a fascinating area. Now, we touched on salt previously before, and I'm just conscious of time, so I'm going to jump over salt and head into iron. And iron clearly is the main one of the main inputs of steel. And really kind of steel in terms of our modern world, and going back 100, 150, don't know when was steel first melted, maybe 150 years ago, the steel age.
Also Bessemer, it began with Bessemer, like in earnest, the modern steel age. I mean, still, they've been making steel really for thousands of years. It's just, and steel is just literally iron, super pure iron with a bit of carbon and a few other things in it. It's an alloy, but it's so confusing because there's things like pig iron and other types of iron, but actually steel is basically a very pure type of iron that's got just a bit of carbon that allows it to be super strong and kind of resilient.
And you talked about, not only did you talk about the idea of going into a steel furnace and just effectively the medieval nature of watching this, and just I can imagine the noise and the smell and the heat of sort of Dante's Inferno type sort of scenario. You did talk about the idea that steel is about to go through the whole steel industry, which is significantly, it does feel a bit medieval in terms of the way, and we still kind of, we know the basics, but you talked about the idea it's going to go through, it's about on the precipice of another transformation. Can you just talk through more of that?
Yeah, so when we're making steel, you are taking rock and turning it into lava, which in turn gets turned into metal. So there is something very primal about it, and definitely, I went to see a blast furnace a couple of times, and also electric arc furnace, and there's something when you see it there, you smell it, and you witness it. It is an extraordinary thing to behold. But the way that I mean, we're always advancing and improving and making processes more efficient. Okay, so but the basic notion of blast furnaces and then turning that into steel, the basic kind of parameters of that go back decades, if not centuries. So it's pretty, like you say, it's pretty old school. got to be slightly hesitant about that, because it's certainly true that we've refined how good we are at making it over the years, and the steels that we turn out, standard vanilla kind of steels that we turn out these days, are so much better than the stuff that we used to turn out back, kind of a century ago. So things have improved, but the problem here is that the main output, so the main product of a blast furnace, is not steel, it's carbon. In terms of weight of stuff coming out, carbon dioxide is by far and away the biggest product, because in order to take that rock, that iron ore, and rip away all the oxygen from it, you need a lot of coal that goes into the blast furnace, and that in turn it's coking coal, so it kind of then rips away those atoms. And the difficulty here is you're using the coal, you're using it basically for a chemical reaction. And that chemical reaction, what a blast furnace is basically an enormous chemistry set. And we still just haven't come up with a way of making large quantities. That matters, by the way, large quantities. So it's really important, the scale of these things. We haven't come up with a way of doing it without emitting enormous amounts of carbon. And steel making, there's only, I'm trying to remember the numbers of them. I think there's less than 1,000. There's a very finite number of blast furnaces around the world. I've got the number in the book. It's a really small, surprisingly small number of these furnaces. This relative handful of furnaces are responsible for something like 7-8% of global carbon emissions.
Wow.
So, and Port Talbot, which is the biggest blast furnace, there's a couple of them there in Wales. It's the steel making place for Tata these days. That is the single biggest carbon emitter in the UK, and it's the same thing, I imagine, for all of the ones in China. So China massively dominates it. It's crazy, actually.
Yeah.
I think the statistic is, in the last year and a half or 2 years, China has produced more steel than Britain, the place that invented modern steel making, has in its entire history. And it just churns it out kind of every year. But here in the UK, we are, in particular, we've got these blast furnaces. We don't make much steel via what are called electric arc furnaces, and that's totally illogical, because electric arc furnaces, what they do is they basically take old scrap steel, and we're really good at recycling steel. It may seem like a dirty sector, but it's incredibly efficient at taking old steel and recycling it. And we just don't have many of them in this country. Instead, what happens is we ship off all our old steel from cars and buildings and everything off to Turkey, and then it gets put into electric arc furnaces or used as scrap over there. Whereas here, we don't really do much of that. And so the big thing that's happening in the UK industry now is they're going to get rid of those blast furnaces in Port Talbot and replace them with electric arc furnaces, where you basically throw in old steel, you mix it up, you have a little bit of virgin stuff in there, a little tiny bit of coal, but it is much less carbon intensive. So you are creating a much more sustainable way of doing it. Now, that's fine in a country like the UK, where you have quite a lot of scrap steel already. But it's not going to work in places like, Africa, where you're going to need crazy amounts of steel in the future to build the infrastructure that you need, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa, parts of Asia, parts of South America. And so there you still probably do need virgin steel making. Yeah. And again, we're still at the early stages of working out how to do that without emitting much carbon. There's something called, hydrogen DRI, direct reduced iron, I think it is. And so there are kind of, there are new technologies and new opportunities, but the difficulty with all of these things, and it goes for cement and concrete as well, which is another topic I talk about in my kind of sand section. What makes cement and steel so important to the world? In the world that you kind of walk around, there is an enormous amount of concrete, enormous amount of steel. And particularly in urbanized centers, you just can't have cities without steel, and you can't have them without concrete. Especially when they go together with reinforced concrete. It is everything. Every building, particularly modern buildings, you can look at, they need these things. What makes them both so effective as materials isn't just that they are really good at doing what they do, and they are really good. They're kind of really strong, they're really firm, they've got this kind of resilience as building products. It's also that there's just a hell of a lot of them out there. It's very easy to get hold of them, and it's very easy to deploy them. So, laying down ready-mixed cement is actually pretty straightforward. Putting steel into buildings well, you can get that steel pretty cheaply from anywhere in large quantities, which you need.
Mm.
So mastering that, not just being able to make steel in a laboratory or in a test facility, but being able to make it through one of these new models, DRI perhaps, and being able to turn out loads are two entirely separate questions.
Yeah.
And we're so far from being able to turn out lots of low carbon steel. In Sweden, they're doing some amazing things with it, but it's still tiny quantities. And so that's what I think hasn't been kind of fully appreciated. It seems like it's kind of a slightly boring, tedious point to make, but it's like everything. Scale is everything.
Yeah.
You can make low carbon cement, for instance, in a laboratory very effectively. You can make amazing low carbon cements, but they're quite arduous to make. Whereas, can you really imagine, for instance, that there's one type of cement that is almost kind of carbon negative, but you need to lay it down inside a chamber full of carbon dioxide. So it needs to set within that environment. Can you imagine having to impose that on your average building site where people are just pouring kind of cement and concrete into a kind of wooden mold?
Yeah.
So the practicalities, you keep coming back to this thing in the material world. It's about the practicalities of taking stuff and turning it into the environments that surround us.
And the idea of as you said, sub-Saharan Africa and emerging Asia. I'm thinking kind of the building sites of Bangladesh and the building sites of Nigeria, where they simply have, the local economies just have this demand. They just need buildings built. They need bridges, they need buildings, they need roads. They just need this stuff built, and they're going to do it in, frankly, the easiest, simplest way they can do it. Without necessarily taking cheapest and most importantly, and not most, but one of the most important. So the idea of them not having that, but I guess the idea of this technology can make leaps to this world, because as you rightly highlighted before, the iPhone and mobile and actually has leapt. The iPhone leapt to emerging countries where banking, traditional banking hadn't reached emerging economies yet. Banking on your iPhone did, and it jumped over potentially traditional banking. So look, I totally get it, and there are challenges, significant challenges around to do this, and look, I think you've highlighted them.
There's leapfrog technologies, isn't it? And those, and it's quite exciting in some ways. Like China's actually a good example of this. China has really struggled to make a domestic car industry when it was internal combustion engines, because it's just quite hard to make an internal combustion engine. It's like there's a reason why it's been Europe and a few other places, Japan and the US have been so dominant there. China really struggled, but then making an electric car is a very different kind of business, and they've just had leapfrog and now completely kind of dominate that field. And it could be the same with lots of other technologies.
Absolutely. And that's going to segue nicely. I'm going to jump to, using that segue, going to jump to lithium, and then we might come back to copper. Sure. Let's see if we've got time. But you mentioned before around lithium, and the idea that this is, in terms of the energy transformations, and this potentially is the next energy transformation that we're going through. With lithium. And you talked about the idea of today, and also in the book, how China is really leading the way. One thing that struck me around lithium is the idea that it's for a potential substance or material that is so vital to the next century. There's a lot of people who really don't actually want to make it or produce it, and there are significant hurdles around, frankly, producing lithium. Do you want to kind of talk about that a bit more?
Yeah, well, so I went to the Salar de Atacama, which is in Chile, and it's the world's biggest single reserve of lithium. Yeah. It's kind of an amazing place. It's up in the high the Altiplano, so it's a very dry, kind of desert-like mountainous area just on the foothills of the Andes, really. And it's a very strange environment. It's partly down to the geology and the weather conditions of the Andes that this place exists, that you have this big pool, and it's essentially a salt flat, and underneath the salt is a lot of lithium brine. So there's this underground reservoir that has this kind of briny lithium stuff, salty brine. And interestingly, the way that you're getting that out is very similar to the way that the ancient Phoenicians used to get salt out of seawater. It's the same thing. You evaporate away the different salts, and eventually you're left with lithium. But this is one of the driest parts of the world, and there's an enormous amount of local resistance to these big places making lithium. In fact, part of the reason that Chile is kind of actually struggling to make as much lithium as it would like to right now is because of various restrictions and regulations about how much it's allowed to. And Chile might well get overtaken. It's already been overtaken by Australia, because in Australia, the way they get their lithium is very different. It's hard rock deposits, and basically it's more like traditional mining. You blast it out, and then you take that rock and you kind of grind it down and set it, use pyrometallurgical things, which basically means lots of heat. And you end up with lithium that way as well. And they're able to turn out far more. In fact, most of it gets refined in China. That's the other kind of big part of this. But in Chile, it's difficult because we're kind of at the beginning of a new frontier here. We've got lots of history of mining iron and copper, and I will talk about copper because in some senses sexy things like lithium get a lot of the attention these days, but actually I think kind of it's the boring stuff like copper that is even more important possibly. But we've got lots of experience of mining that stuff. We don't have much experience of mining lithium. It's a very new thing, and that's what makes it quite interesting in this book. We have an opportunity to try and do it in maybe a more enlightened way, because a lot of the mining of the other stuff, as you'll have seen from the book, is really dirty, and there's, I'm sure, a better way of doing it that doesn't involve as much damage to the environment. But it's, by the same token, it is because it's kind of new territory. We need to kind of we need to basically ratchet up our production quite quickly. I'm not especially worried about us kind of not having enough lithium. I think there's pretty much every study shows there's plenty of lithium. There's not going to be a shortage. And actually, there was a recent discovery of a load of lithium in America and certain types of clays. Still question marks over about how easily you can extract it. But we're not going to run out of this stuff. But we need a lot of it because, like I say, one of the kind of most extraordinary achievements of the last few decades was the invention of the lithium-ion battery. We take it for granted because it's in our smartphones, it's there, and it's just like, it's a battery. Okay, who cares? We've got other rechargeable batteries. Why do you care about lithium-ion batteries? Well, back in the early days of the motor car, there were electric cars. So for a brief period at the start of the 20th century, you had electric cars, you had petrol engine cars, and also steam cars. So there was a kind of three-way battle between these different kind of energy sources. And in the end, the petrol engine won. And part of the reason it won out against the electric car, which was doing pretty well and for a while was more popular, was just because the batteries were rubbish. They only had lead acid batteries, that same type that you have in your kind of petrol car these days to start it. So they only had lead iron batteries, really heavy, not very efficient, not much range, all of that stuff. And so they were just a bit useless. It took pretty much 100 years, the best part of a century, to invent the lithium-ion battery. Everyone knew, just looking at the periodic table, that lithium ought to be the best battery material, and it's still, there is nothing else that comes close when it comes to the energy storage than lithium, just in terms of its kind of chemical logic. But it took so long because it's a very volatile substance. It took so long to actually invent the batteries. So we now have them invented. We're going to have to turn out incredible amounts of them, and if we're going to have the electric cars that everyone's going to be driving in the future, and for that matter, all of the kind of devices that we're continuing to use, that is going to involve a lot more exploitation. It's going to involve uncomfortable conversations about where it comes from. But like I say, I think it's not that we don't have it. It's that there's I think part of the resistance these days isn't so much about the availability. It's just about the willingness of people to actually go and mine it. And that I suppose that brings us kind of back to copper. Like, we've got thousands of years of experience of mining copper, but basically we've got a lot of the easy stuff. So a lot of the easy stuff is now kind of out of the ground. The stuff we're going to have to get in the future is going to be much lower yield, or we're going to have to go to places where in the past we've always been a bit reluctant to get it. Like, for instance, countries like the DRC, the Democratic Republic of Congo. That's where a lot of the cobalt, most of the cobalt, comes from. There's also really high grades of copper. It's usually found alongside copper. And some people are talking seriously about mining under the sea. The reason they're doing that is because we're going to need incredible amounts of this stuff. I went to this mine. It is the world's biggest man-made hole, a place called Chuquicamata in Chile. It is a canyon. You know, it's like looking into the Grand Canyon when you're standing on the lip of it. It's crazy just how enormous and deep it is. But we need another 3 of those every year to satisfy those, you know, demands for copper, if we're going to have enough copper for electrification, because you need more copper in an electric car than you do lithium. You need more copper in all the grids, for instance, that are going to kind of traverse the countries. And that's, by the way, another thing, we need enormous amounts of investment in grids. It's very unfashionable to talk about grids. It's getting more fashionable to talk about grids, but it's like that is a massive thing. Copper to go in transformers, copper to go into all of the different production of all the different cables and things. So I think in a way, I'm more worried about copper availability than I am about lithium availability in the future. And it's the boring stuff. It's like, do you have enough copper? Do you have enough ball clay? So ball clay, I think half of the world's ball clay actually still gets mined in Cornwall or Devon or maybe Dorset. Anyway, in England. And you need that ball clay for some of the insulators that you have in transformers.
Right.
So like around the world, you know, in India, in China, there's British ball clay on all of these big kind of high voltage transformers and things. And so it's boring stuff like that matters just as much as the sexy stuff. And that's the thing. I mean, like this book is all about how the seemingly boring turns out to be really fascinating and more interesting than you ever thought.
No, it's thank you. It's brilliant. And then look, in terms of wrapping up, I've got a few minutes to go. I just want to read back to you something which kind of threw me out in terms of when you talked about the kind of the idea of the single switch on and the inherent problems that we have in terms of continuing to develop and this energy transformation and what we need to do. And you talked about the idea of to replace a small natural gas turbine, which pumps out energy to 100,000 homes. Okay. To get the energy to do that, we need 20 wind turbines. Fine. Okay. Wind turbines, you think that's okay. Okay. But then the wind has to be right, all of that stuff. But what was actually, and you think the trade-off, okay, that sounds reasonable. But then the thing that struck me is to build the wind turbines, we need 30,000 tons of iron, 50,000 tons of concrete, 900 tons of plastic and fiberglass, and 540 tons of copper. That's to build those wind turbines. So yes, that is, yes, we're going to a renewable energy source, but to get to that point requires an enormous amount of these materials coming out of the ground. Yeah. And that really just struck with me. Just there's their challenge.
Yeah, and that goes back to where we started, really, the scale of the challenge we've set ourselves, because it is inherently quite a big infrastructure challenge.
Yep.
And that's before you kind of get to the thing of like, you have to reimagine the whole nature of electricity grids, because in the past it's always been the case that you have power stations dotted around the country, mostly near to the urban areas where they're most needed. Now you have wind turbines and maybe solar panels, but in our case, mostly wind turbines where the wind is, and the wind isn't in the same place. So the wind is off in the North Sea, and so you need to find a way of getting it from there to here. So that means even more infrastructure than those simple amounts that you were describing there. And so, and also, by the way, you need a lot more wind turbine megawatt kind of availability than you would with a kind of a power station, like a gas-fired power station, just because
the density
of the inherent kind of intermittency of it. So you need to basically be able to overshoot what your potential need is, so that you can then balance it out and have a lot more that then goes into storage and then can get kind of stored in the future. So the scale of it is pretty mind-boggling. The degree of these boring minerals that we will continue to have to mine to fulfill all our promises is extraordinary as well. I don't think, like, the thing that I struggle with a bit though is, so some people understandably when they hear about this stuff think, well, it's just too difficult and we've set ourselves too hard a task, so why are we even bothering with it? And I think these days that's what a lot of people, a lot of the kind of skeptical voices are no longer so skeptical about the kind of the climate science and are slightly more skeptical about our ability to achieve it.
Yeah.
But I think the thing that I kind of look at is, first of all, we've we continue to kind of get better and better at making these things for smaller costs. So the learning curves that we have, which reduce your average cost of making your given battery or wind turbine or solar panel, you know, those costs are going down, and we're getting better and better at making this stuff, which is kind of amazing. It's been the case, by the way, for other stuff as well. Humans just get better and better at making things over the years, and it's one of the I think the unchampioned kind of economic phenomena. But I think partly thanks to that, and partly there's so much of the stuff that is in this book, like making the silicon chips using extreme ultraviolet lithography. A lot of people back in the kind of 70s and the 80s, when people were first starting to think about it, said that it was just going to be impossible. It would never happen. It was too big a feat. A lot of people said that, you know, when we forgot the recipe for concrete, for cement, you know, the Romans knew how to make cement, and we forgot it for more than 1,000 years, that we'd never rediscover that recipe, but we rediscovered it. And a lot of people said that the silicon chip, the solid state semiconductor, would never happen, just in the same way that some people are skeptical that the solid state battery will never happen these days. That's one of the next things to happen. So there's always naysayers and skeptics, and yet we do seem to be pretty good at actually kind of innovating on this stuff. It just sometimes takes a bit longer than people expect. And so I'm kind of both at the same time kind of quite nervous about the coming years, because like I say, I don't think we've wised up to how big of a transition it is, but also quite excited about it, because, you know, when else in recent history have we set ourselves the task of having to achieve an industrial revolution, which is basically what we're going to have to do here. It is reimagining the nature of how we make stuff. It's an industrial revolution, and so we've set ourselves this massive task. In my kind of day job covering economics, you know, people have been moaning for the last 2 decades really about how we've been stuck in secular stagnation, about how productivity has been disappointing for all that period. Well, we have the single biggest opportunity here for potential productivity gains. Yes, massive challenges on the energy side, but there's opportunities there. So I'm kind of excited as much as I am terrified about it, and that by the same token means there are big opportunities out there for anyone, you know, who wants to seize them. It doesn't look like the UK is seizing as many of them as it you know, perhaps did in the past. But we'll see. It's exciting. I think it's an exciting time to be living in.
Look, I think that brings us to, that's a perfect way to summarize where we're headed and what we're doing, and the idea of human ingenuity, never short human ingenuity, because we've managed to find ways through. You know, we were all thought a few years ago, we were going to be locked away forever, and human ingenuity found a way through that, and we will continue to find ways. So look, I'd share your sentiments in terms of the optimism, but I think the more people understand the scale of the trade-offs required, hence, and something like this book brings that to life, then the better placed I think, you know, we can be going forwards to have serious, proper grown-up conversations, instead of just ranting at my way is the right way and why don't you listen, to have proper grown-up conversations about priorities and trade-offs and all of that stuff. But look, Ed, I've taken you for too much time, so thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it. If anyone, I'm just going to put up on the book, if anyone's watching, there it is, Material World, Ed Conway. Look it up on Amazon. Buy it in good bookstores.
All good bookstores.
All good bookstores. Ed, appreciate your time, and look, catch up soon.
Thank you.
Thank you.